Hi, Nick Dogle, North State Law. We safeguard your professional license so you can get back to business. We're going to demystify a little bit more of that legal jargon for you today, with the question being, why do licensed professionals have a right to a hearing? So, long and short of it is we have a due process right. And I'll get into more about what due process is, and then how we end up getting a due process right for the professional license. But a lot of times when people are going through a process with a licensing entity, they might not even it might not even dawn on them that, hey, I have a right to this hearing. And why do I have a right to this hearing? Because most of the time when people have a complaint filed against them, and the complaint is working its way through whatever licensing board or state agency's process, you know they might not even get to the point where they need a hearing. It might be dismissed, or it might be like, hey, we're going to send you this warning letter. It's not considered administrative action, so just don't do that again. Right. So in a situation like that, or the dismissal, you don't really have a due process, right? Because there's been no, action by a government agency or a licensing board, which is technically a government agency. So if a licensing board or agency comes back after a review by one of their committees and says, hey, we actually think that you might have done something here, there's enough evidence to proceed, we want to implement a suspension of your license for a year or two, or a revocation, or a public reprimand, or a fine, whatever they would do that would be considered administrative action, they're also going to put in their letter to you that you have a right to a hearing. You have to request a hearing within a set time frame. It depends on whatever the statute or the administrative code says, but usually it's either 15 days or 30 days. And if it's a strictly state agency where you have to file a petition with the Office of Administrative Hearings, then you have to go that route. If it's a board that's not utilizing the Office of Administrative Hearings, then you have to request it straight from the board. And part of that is understanding, like, to whom do I request this? Do I have to file a petition with OAH, or can I go directly to the board? If I go directly to the board, do I send it to the board's attorney? Do I send it to their executive director? Do I send it to their investigator? Who do I send it to? So part of the process is knowing what steps to take next, when to take them, and to whom do we take those requests. So those are all part of the process. So going back to the original question of why do we have that right to a hearing, it really does boil down to due process. And how did we get due process? Well, we got due process when the country was founded. We had a lot of smart individuals. Yes, did they do some things that they shouldn't have done way back in the day? Absolutely, 100%. But they did a lot of things right. They got some things wrong, but they did get a lot of things right. And one of those was making sure that individuals have a right to due process. That's laid out in the Bill of Rights. Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution talks about due process. The 14th Amendment also talks about due process, but that is more in lines of telling the state and local governments that, hey, you cannot deprive somebody of life, liberty, or property without affording them due process. And due process being some sort of opportunity to be heard if the government is going to try to implement something that is going to take your life, take your liberty, or take your property. And that process nowadays looks at like a trial, a hearing, some sort of tribunal, something along those lines, where the individual that holds the professional license, for example, has the opportunity to be heard in a fair and impartial manner with a set process that not only does the government have to follow, but the individual has to follow as well. And that's what we do have. And why we have it is because, as I mentioned, you got the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, you got the 14th Amendment Constitution, but also you have state constitutions. And we're lucky enough that where we live in North Carolina, our state constitution, if it doesn't mirror the U.S. Constitution, it is pretty close to it, mirroring it almost exactly. So we get a lot of the protections that we have in the US Constitution, we get the same ones under the state constitution. In fact, most of the, if not all of the 13 original colonies will have similar measures in their state constitutions as are in the US Constitution, because everybody from those states, for the most part, was very instrumental in forming the country. A lot of people from Virginia, obviously, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, New York, Massachusetts, et cetera, et cetera. They were all instrumental in forming the country. So as a result, when they were doing their own constitutions, like I said, if they didn't mirror the U.S. Constitution, they are really close, and they offer us the same protections as the U.S. Constitution does, but on the state level. But with the 14th Amendment being in there for due process rights, um, that's extra protection that everybody throughout the whole country has in regards to a government not being able to come and take your life, liberty, or property without first affording you some sort of proper due process. And with due process, we have two different kinds. It's procedural due process, which is most applicable where I'm talking about, and substantive due process, which I'm not really going to get into because you don't really need to know that right now because it's not applicable to what we're referring to. So procedural due process obviously means the process by which we are able to keep the government from taking life, liberty, or property. So that's kind of what we have on both of those. Now, I also want to get into one more thing where we talk about, well, are we under the life? Are we under the liberty? Or are we under the property that the government's trying to take when we have a professional license? Right? Obviously, not trying to take your life because it is, license. It's not your life. I mean, it's your livelihood. And that's why it's a liberty interest, because everybody has the right to be free and choose and be happy with what they want to do with their life. And having a profession is one of the cornerstones to hopefully a happy life and a free life. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people out there that hate their jobs and they hate their professions, but they're free to choose something else if they want. If they want to choose to stay in that profession that they hate and that job they hate, that's their decision. But if they want to choose to go into a different career path, a different profession, they have a right to do that as well. And yes, the government can set certain parameters around that, but at the end of the day, they can't take that profession from you and not allow you to pursue that which makes you happy, which would be that profession, without affording you some sort of proper due and fair process. Property interest a little bit more clear cut because you have that professional license that's yours. Probably get some pushback on that from some people, but there is a lot of case law out there that backs me up, and not only case law through the U.S. Supreme Court, but also North Carolina Court of Appeals, North Carolina Supreme Court as well, when talking about liberty and property interests and how those allow us a due process as licensed professionals. So with the property interest, it's a little bit little intricacy in there because, like, I can't transfer my law license to somebody else, right? And if you're an engineer or you're a general contractor, you're not transferring your license to somebody else. Like if you get the individual license, you're not, as a GC, you're not transferring it to somebody else. If you're the qualifier, you're the qualifying individual for that. You're not transferring it over to Bob Smith, who will then be that qualifier. No, that's, Jim Smith's. So that further backs up the argument that it is a property interest in that license because a lot of these licenses are not transferable. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of some sort of facility licenses because those can be transferred. But when it talks about like the individual professional, those cannot be transferred as well. But the property interest is, professional license. So if it's a facility and you want to run a daycare, for example, and you have a daycare license, they can't just snatch that thing from you. They have to afford you the opportunity for a contested hearing and afford proper process when conducting that. And I think the main thing with process is it can't be some sham hearing. There has to be clear set of rules and process that both sides have to adhere to. There has to be an independent, impartial third party that's hearing the case. There has to be a set of rules that everybody's got to go by to make sure that there's no shenanigans going on, for lack of better phrasing, right? So a lot of times with how we do hearings and trials or even tribunals in the US, we've got rules of evidence, we've got the rules of civil procedure, and those are implemented when you're doing a hearing for an Office of Administrative Hearings case, for example, or say you got a Board of Nursing hearing coming up. Well, you got to go by the rules of evidence, got to go by the rules of civil procedure, and then other rules that might be applicable that are in a specific administrative code or specific statute as well. So there's a whole process that everybody has to adhere to, and it's supposed to be a fair and impartial process. So I hope that was helpful. If you got any questions, check out the blogs on my website first at northstatelawfirm.com's website, or the other videos on my YouTube channel. It's North State Law's YouTube channel. And if you still can't find what you're looking for in either one of those spots, then feel free to give my office a call or text at 919-521-8810. That's 919-521-8810. And you get a free 15-minute discovery call with a member of my staff. Everybody have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.